Welcome to the Fishing Daily podcast. Today I'm joined by Elaine Whyte from the Clyde Fishermen's Association and Duncan MacInnes from the Western Isles Fishermen's Association. And we're here today to talk about the Scottish Government's plans to introduce highly protected marine areas. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Scottish coastal communities and their political representatives are upset by the Scottish Government's plans for highly protected marine areas. And we've witnessed senior Scottish National Party MSPs giving out about this issue. Where does the disconnect between the Scottish Government's plans and the reality of their proposals lie?
I think the first thing to say is that fishermen are not in any way opposed to sensible conservation. And I think the opposition from my perspective is to arbitrary targets which have been developed as part of a political agreement, which are now being kind of imposed from a top-down position. And I think what we have to keep in mind is that fishermen have been involved in a number of conservation projects like MPAs, etc., for the last, really almost eight years, really. And they have to be evaluated for a sense check, I think. So I think where a lot of fishing communities are coming from is that we have already sacrificed a lot for conservation, and we need to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing before we proceed on with more arbitrary targets. But Duncan may have a different approach.
Yeah, well, certainly the way we view it as an industry is that highly protected marine areas were developed between the SNP and the Green Party as part of the Bute House Agreement. There was no consultation whatsoever with communities that were going to be impacted on, and it was purely a politically driven motive or a policy decision that had no scientific background research into it, and to say that 10% of Scottish seas should be designated, with no scientific evidence to back up that, was clearly the wrong way to develop any policy, in particular after the industry, as Elaine had said, had been for even 10 years, probably, going back 10 years from about 2013 to 2016 in consultation with government, before marine protected areas were introduced. And the final outcome of that was the worst case scenario for the fishing industry. And despite having been told that they would be assessed after 6 years, that assessment hasn't been done. And as far as the industry is concerned, there has been no benefit whatsoever to communities after the first tranche of MPAs that were introduced in about 2016. So before any other designations are even considered, we must have accurate, independent and impartial assessment done of what has been done in the past, and that simply hasn't been done. What has been done is a tick box exercise by government to suit their own needs.
Well, in December 2019, there was a paper published entitled Ecological and Socio-Economic Effects of Highly Protected Marine Areas in Temperate Waters now. And this talked about not so much the benefits of the MPAs, but talked about the benefits of HPMAs. Now, Scottish Link, which is an amalgamation of NGOs, referred to this in an article earlier this month. But strangely, the paper itself states that if the threat to an area is overfishing of target species, this may thus be more effectively dealt with by measures to curb fishing effort rather than to establish HPMAs. Do you believe there are better answers than HPMAs?
Yes. In short, yes. I think every marine area is different, and I think it depends on the tidal element, the weather round about there, the features round about it. What kind of fishing happens, what kind of species is in the water, and I think all of those factors should come into play when considering how you best protect something. So, for instance, if you have an area which it doesn't have such a high percentage of features, but it potentially has a real predator issue with maybe spur dog predating another fish types, etc., that might be your issue for that area, and it might not be in another region. So I think to come out with blanket policies that talk about, you know, how we manage all around the coast is a problem from the beginning. I think what we actually need is a very strong IFG structure where local fishermen can be working with governments, giving them observed data about what's happening in that area. Very similar to what happens in Norway, so that we can have good local management which is appropriate to that area and that community and those stocks and features. But again, I'll hand over to Duncan in case he has a different view on that.
Yeah, well, my view is, you see, after the Inshore Act of 1984, which replaced the 3-mile prohibition on the use of waterboards, it was offering an opportunity to communities to have a look at what could be done and considered under kind of local management. And here in the Western Isles, we operated and developed seasonal closures as part of that kind of regional management. However, during that period, the government decided themselves to close an area just north of Stornoway, which is Broad Bay. And the reason for the closure was to protect juvenile place. This was in total opposition to the local industry at that particular time. However, it was closed. Place has not increased in any volumes or any abundance since that was closed in nearly 40 years ago. The main target species that suffered the most or was prohibited due to that closure was scallop dredging, which was permitted inside 3 miles previously. Now, what we are seeing 40 years on is that bay is no longer a prolific bay for scallops. All that's left there is it's a marine desert. It's full of starfish, and they're the main predator. And there's no scallop, virtually no scallops left in that bay. At the same time, there was a seasonal closure in the Sound of Barra which permitted scallop dredging for half the year on a seasonal basis, with gaps in between to coincide with to reduce static gear conflict and also to aid conservation and to aid the markets. That Sound of Barra area now, 40 years on, is producing the highest meat yielding scallops in the whole of Scotland and inshore waters. The ones that fish there have been having a very sustainable and well managed fishery in that period of time. And what's the Scottish Government proposing now to do in the Sound of Barra is to close that area to scallop dredging and not take any cognizance of what has happened in the Western Isles with an area that has already been closed for 40 years. So without any shadow of a doubt, we've already operated seasonal closures and creel prohibition areas in the Western Isles, which have been very, very effective. We've had lobster V-notching schemes. We've introduced maximum landing size for female lobsters, prohibition on the landing of crippled male lobsters, and those kind of things are yielding benefit. And there has been absolutely no benefit whatsoever to the community in a total closure of an area for 40 years. And they talk about Lamlash Bay. Why do they not go to an area that's been closed for 40 years and see what was there? Because Marine Scotland Science went there in 2007 as part of their West of Scotland scallop survey. When they went in there, we have the photos that were taken by Marine Scotland Science, and they've never seen so many starfish in an area. So that's our example of, an area that's been closed to mobile gear. So we're talking from experience in our own area. It may be different in other areas, but we certainly don't want any other similar prohibitions in our area without detailed research being done on what's already been in place.
Yeah, I have to agree with everything that Duncan said, and it's true all over the coast. I mean, I think local fishermen have come up with very good conservation measures. People may assume that we don't want to do anything, but we work through the IFGs, and we've proposed things like, you know, curfews, limits on sizes, pot size limitation schemes. There are so many different schemes that are actually going through the IFGs at the moment. Sometimes they are curtailed by resource, but that's the right way to do it, and to keep monitoring to see that if what you have proposed is actually correct. And what I worry about is that we're getting to a point now where people are frightened to maybe suggest good conservation schemes, because they feel that they will not only suggest them, but they will have additional measures put on top of them, like highly protected marine areas, which will mean there really isn't going to be much fishing at all. So I think the best thing is to go back to the drawing board and work with the communities and work with the fishermen who are conservation minded.
And just following on from that, our experience, you know, with a brown crab fishery and developing a brown crab fishery way back in the 70s, when the EU markets opened, the crab on the ground hadn't been fished. It was in poor condition, black spotted crab. And the scientists were saying, and everyone else was saying, that no one was wanting that because the quality of it was so poor. It needed to be fished out. And now the crab on the west coast, say 40 years on, the quality as good as anywhere else in the UK. So it clearly shows you have to harvest the marine environment in a sustainable way if there's too many stock are left on the grounds. And similarly with cockles, they won't thrive and the quality will be inferior. And we've seen that with brown crab, we've seen it with cockles, and we also see it with razorfish, where there's over provision and not enough feed for the grounds. So sustainable harvesting of the marine environment is the prudent and sensible way forward.
This seems to be a more harmonised way of managing stock sustainably. Why do you think this is? Well, you sort of alluded to it in your answer, Elaine, but why is it that the Green parties are ignoring this?
This is a question that we asked often. Why do we have a lot of other stakeholders who don't really seem to want to work with fishermen and can at times really target them without really listening to what they would say or what they've done already? I can't tell you exactly why, but I do think that we have a real management issue in Scotland. I think our government are under a lot of pressure from a lot of these groups, and I think that the flow of money that is coming in externally to Scotland is certainly now starting to skew the policy process and the management process. And that is of a massive concern to me. So I can only assume that some people would prefer to find a problem and then they have funding for a solution. We do have problems, but there is a way to find solutions if we can work in collaboration with our local coastal communities who are sustainable. But that doesn't seem to attract the same money externally. And I think that we have a major problem with that, not only at a fishing representative level, but also at a government level, because our civil servants are under pressure too.
Duncan, and what's your opinion? Do you think there's reasons behind it?
Well, clearly following on from what Elaine was saying, technology, for example, has moved on apace, and we have remote electronic monitoring on what we classify as high-risk vessels, and any zoning approach should be done. And when we look back at marine protected areas, they were introduced based on flawed information. The economic impact that went out for public consultation was seriously flawed, and if the accurate information that and the negative impact that those would have had on communities, it would be far more difficult for ministers to have signed off that. One example is where the economic impact was going to be £20,000. However, it was £250,000 on 2 vessels in an area. And in many areas, 2 vessels is the heart of some of the more fragile and rural areas, because you've got 6 6 families there, and those fishing has kept communities and sustained schools in communities. And it's very interesting to note that some of the ones that did come from Europe into Scotland, probably about 20 years ago, saw Scotland as a land of opportunity due to less regulations than they were coming from Poland in particular. Now they're seriously considering their own position on the back of over-regulation, and many of them are heading back home. So Scotland is no longer a welcoming country to those Europeans that came in 20 years ago, and the HPMAs will just hasten the retreat and will result in many of those that are working at sea and in processing factories going back. So it will absolutely destroy industries that have been, the strength of those communities have been based on the marine environment and has provided sustainable long-term employment, which many other tourism jobs are part-time, and the fishing industry has provided that continuation and sustainability and good employment opportunities.
We're hearing that we got from anti-HPMA campaigners that the coastal communities will be wiped out if these things are implemented. Is this just scaremongering, or is it a real fact?
Yeah, I don't think it's scaremongering. Firstly, I think it's difficult to say that there's anti-highly protected marine areas campaigners, because I think most fishing communities and most of their families would rather not spend their time campaigning. We'd rather spend their time looking after our families and actually just doing our jobs sensibly and sustainably. So I think to put us into the campaigning box is difficult, because we don't want to be that. I think in general, I think what we want to just be is sustainable workers. I think it is an incredibly difficult thing to try and assess, because I think after the MPAs in the Clyde, we lost 25 boats in the 6 years that were preceding that. If you look at an area like Tarwart, that had 20 odd boats, and now has 6 that are operating out of there. Now, there will undeniably be other factors that have impacted on fishing, particularly COVID and Brexit. I mean, this happens. However, we can't deny that the MPAs have had a massive impact. So to think that you're then going to superimpose a highly protected marine area structure on top of that, and as Duncan said, in previous rounds, we know that the financial impact of those initial measures were greatly underestimated. And it's not all about the financial impact, it's about the social impact that flows from that. I mean, Duncan had mentioned if you lose a few boats, it's the heart of the community. It's maybe 4 or 5 children out the local school. And I just don't think there's an understanding of the chains, the social chains and the cultural change that flow. It's not all about just money, it's about culture. And we have to be representing how much there's already been a damage to that.
Just following on, from that, the strength of those that are pushing for HPMAs and those designations that will destroy communities come from campaigning groups that don't live in those areas. And if you were to impose something similar on the central belt of Glasgow, where far more carbon is emitted and far more pollution is done to the overall environment, and say, that you're going to close off or they're going to lose so many jobs, they don't understand the impact that those are going to have on coastal communities. And we're talking about fishing, you're looking at fish farming, seaweed harvesting, and all other kind of methods of employment that are taking place in the marine environment. And the collective and the cumulative impact of HPMAs, along with MPAs, SACs, priority marine features out with marine protected areas, and the cumulative effect of that is such immense that it will destroy communities, and it has created the most uncertainty in the fishing industry that I've ever experienced in my 40 years involvement with it. We've been involved with a fisheries investment scheme that has been a model that the local authority has been with the Royal Bank and industry on providing investment to vessels for first-time vessel owner buyers and to upgrade vessels. And this is the first year that over the last 18 months, we have seen a significant decline in the number of applications that are coming in. And it's all to do with uncertainty on the back of HPMAs. It's reducing investment onshore, and people aren't willing to invest and upgrade their businesses. We're already hearing, as part of the Bute House Agreement, a cap on fishing effort inside 3 miles. That hasn't been based on any science. It came out of the Bute House Agreement, and that comes on the west coast where there is about 7,000 tonne of nephrops that is not being caught, and that's based on a scientific stock assessment that has been done. And the reason it hasn't been caught is that the number of licenses that have already left, particularly over 10-metre vessels from the Irish Sea all the way up to Orkney on the west coast, has been left because of ageing vessels. The licenses were detached and sold on and restructured the pelagic fleet. So the pelagic fleet have gone richer on the back of those communities on the west coast. And now we're seeing that those communities are now going to lose the entitlements they had to those stocks just on the back of capping effort at current levels of effort. So there's an avalanche of things that are coming against those West Coast communities, and you need to be active in them and understand the cumulative effect that that will have. And looking at about 7,000 tonne, you're talking about, for the public purse, there's at least £40 million of additional value. That's first-hand sales that could be generated on the west coast of Scotland from nephrops alone. But yet they're looking at closing down those fisheries. And why should those communities suffer on the back of pelagic, that have gobbled up all those licenses? So that's the way I view the overall policy that has been devised by the current Scottish Government.
Yeah, if I could just come in there as well. I think Duncan makes a really strong point about these rural communities and fishing communities, and I don't think we can underestimate the harm to them. But I think there's also an underestimation of what this means to the country, because there's an invisible thread that runs from fishing that goes right into the inland processors in areas like Lanarkshire and Glasgow, and the exporters who are sending things from the Central Belt as well. There is a massive chain that's being ignored almost, but which is going to have a national effect on Scotland. And why would we want to and when we say that we want to make ourselves a competitive country, we could thrive and we could do so much better. Why would we want to do this, almost destroy part of our industry, which is operating sustainably when there is so much potential? It makes no sense.
Just following on from what Elaine was saying, Macduff Shellfish, they invested £4.5 million in a new processing plant in Stornoway, all before HPMAs did come out. And I'm sure if they were aware of the current position, they wouldn't have made that investment. And on top of an effort cap inside 3 miles on their main target species is nephrops. And in the short time since they moved to Stornoway, they've opened up new markets with new freezing facilities and the quality being frozen. And now they're exporting to Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, and China, all on the back of premium quality that's being landed within 48 hours of capture. Now, that's being threatened by HPMAs. And in addition to that, we're seeing the uncertainty this has created, whereby they've got vast markets that we can expand to, but at the current moment in time, no one's willing to make that investment on the catching side.
That sounds like an economic drain, really on the economy rather than of being any benefit. You're talking about a lot of jobs being lost in the system, between catching and processing and exporting. What do they expect people to do once these jobs are gone? That's just that'll be another economic drain on the finances of the country as well, won't it?
For sure. I mean, all I can say is, and Duncan will be the same. From the first MPAs that I saw, the boats that we lost, and we talked about we often hear the phrase "just transition." I didn't see a just transition for the members that I saw that lost their living. I didn't see that at all. I saw them going to a job that they didn't want to go to and leaving a lifestyle and a culture which would maybe multi-generational that they didn't want to leave. And I honestly worry about what this is doing to, I mean, my family are all from the West Coast. I hate to see that culture disappearing because that's what it is. And it's not just about someone losing a job and finding something else to do. There's a lot more. It goes right to people's hearts. It's the language, it's the songs. And I think that's why Skip and Inish have touched so many people, because Duncan understands it, I understand it. But a lot of people won't know that it's more than just a job. It's so much more. And so you are doing economic harm, but these people are not being given an opportunity to do something else. And do they want to do something else? I think that's really important, because a just transition is starting to feel like a phrase of something that actually happens to people, whether they want it to happen or not. And then I argue how much of that is just.
Well, it's a bit ironic that 100 years, just that month, that all those vessels left Stornoway, you know, for a land of opportunity over in Canada, and they were saying, you know, that there was no future for them here. And I see those coastal communities on the west coast and on the islands being permanently dependent on fisheries, where there are no other alternative employment opportunities. And particularly when you're looking at the whole marine environment, that you're decimating all the future opportunities in the marine environment, it will be just mass exodus of folk from the islands and from the west coast. And you could very well, and I mean, the song there, the clearances again, highlight very clearly what will happen if those HPMAs are introduced on the west coast and in island communities.
We hear a lot of fancy words, as Elaine said there, just transition. Another fancy word that was used by the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, was he said that if coastal communities vehemently opposes HPMAs, they will not be implemented. Now, this sort of leads to two questions that we need to look at. And one is, what defines a coastal community? And two, where do you draw the line under vehemently?
Yeah, in terms of a coastal community, I mean, I certainly think there's a lot of players involved now, much more than they would have been previously. I think if we're talking, what I worry about is when they talk about fishing community, they will engage with fishing communities and coastal communities, because fishing communities are part of coastal communities. We aren't any different, we're part of that structure. So if we're going to start dividing it down by powerful blocks within communities, I think we have to potentially have at least 3 structures. So we have, you know, the fishing communities, those who are involved in fishing are connected to it. We have potentially ENGO groups who are well funded from either London or America, wherever they're getting their funding from, that are coming into the area and have an interest in a specific one interest group, and which is usually marine environment. It's never usually campaigning for housing or you know, to improve the schools or anything like that. It's usually this one single issue. And then I think there's people who just go about their day as part of the village and part of the community. And I think that's the 3 categories that we're potentially looking at here. But I don't feel comfortable with fishing communities being an other from coastal communities. That's not correct. This feels like a hijacking of language. And in terms of vehemently opposing, I think we've just said we're people that want to go on with our lives. We're people who want to do our job and work sustainably and stay where we want to stay. And I think suggesting that we have to vehemently oppose is almost like invoking us to go with pitchforks and complain outside Parliament. That isn't what we want to do. We're not those kind of people. However, I worry that that language is polarising and may leads to the temperature being ranked up on people who just want sensible solutions to live where they want to live and fish sensibly and sustainably. But Duncan might have a different view from me.
No, I agree. You know, coastal communities are fishing communities. You can't distinguish between both, as particularly on the west coast of Scotland. You know, they're really at the heart of those communities, the sea, and looking at vehemently opposed to them. That's certainly the case in the Western Isles here. The local authority has come out very, very strongly against them. And I have yet to come across one person in the Western Isles that is supportive of it. And NGOs can be very, very selective and get an audience of a handful of folk, you know, that have moved into an area. Many of those that have moved into an area are not dependent on getting any livelihood. They've made their money elsewhere. They're looking at a retirement home and a retirement community and dictate to those communities. And they're not dependent in any way on getting any earned income from those communities. And those that are living in those communities, as far as I can see, I have not come across any working in those communities that are supportive of the direction of travel of the current SNP and the Green administration.
Well, it seems to be an issue in a lot of coastal communities in Scotland and the southwest of England. We even have it here in Ireland. How do you separate this out? How does the government get to the people that they should be speaking to?
I think it's a resource issue, and I've said that to you at the start. I think there's money coming in internationally, which is allowing the direction of policy to be skewed. There's very few fishermen's organisations can afford to, or associations, small ones on the west coast of Scotland, that could afford to continually take the government to court every time they didn't agree with something. But that's not the case for some of these groups. They can do that. They can take the government to court. They can challenge them continually. And I think there's two aspects that we need to think about here. I think the money that's coming in is in a sense drowning the people who normally live there out. You know, if you're an organisation that has 5 full-time employees paid for by significant grants to sit on Twitter or to sit and create, to sit and lobby politicians every day, you tell me how many fishing families can afford that same luxury? They can't. So I think it's a case of really reaching out to the communities, really just, we have to find some way of rebalancing this, because I don't know what Duncan will say, but this is a very hard thing to say. But sometimes I often find I'm the only person with my accent at some of these meetings. And that's not because we don't want people to come into communities. We absolutely do. We've got depopulation issues, but so everyone's welcomed. But it's about being part of that community and not working against it. And I think that is happening, and that worries me greatly. But I don't know how the government get round that, because they are very well resourced. But I think potentially the easiest thing is just going to the grassroots and talking to the actual people who live there. Duncan might have any other ideas.
No, well, the way I see communities on the West Coast and the fishing industry in particular, their strength has been developed on family business and family ownership. And the uniqueness, if you look at the inshore from all the way up from the Clyde, all the way up to Orkney, the uniqueness of the industry there and the strength of it has been built on family-owned development, and it's small scale. And that is the community and the heart of the community that has been there for generations. It will continue for generations if left to do so. And there are other parts of industry that are, large company-owned units, and they have a different approach to fisheries. And I would say that the strength of coastal communities has been built on families, close-knit families, close-knit communities, and that is going to disappear. And that's what will remove the heart from those communities. Once those go, they won't come back in future years at all.
That's a danger, because we're looking at a lot of areas being cleared by young people leaving and going to seek opportunities in Canada and in Australia. And once they move there and get settled, it's very difficult for them to return to somewhere where there's nothing left for them. Elaine, the Clyde Fishermen's Association were involved in creating the no-take zone in Lamlash Bay. And now recently we've seen a tweet from yourselves saying that you weren't invited to the launch of a new research vessel. Has that project been hijacked?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're pretty clear about this. I think our fishermen thought they were doing a good thing getting involved in a no-take zone at the time, because they were trying to be kind of partnership orientated. They actually, our fishermen were quite happy to give an area which was nearly 3 times the size of the current no-take zone up, but Arran Coast didn't want to do that. They wanted to work around the contours, but they wanted a box. And I think at that point it started to become really clear that Arran Coast didn't really want to work with the fishermen the way they would want to work with them. I think the biggest potential, I don't think the fishermen could have ever, the fishing communities could have ever assumed that this would have went the way it went. We didn't know that we were going to actually completely lose guardianship of an area, that there was going to be a massive influx of international funding coming into the area to develop this narrative around what is now referred to as Arran Coast's no-take zone. There's no acknowledgement generally of the local fishermen or the government. And sometimes they will say precursory, oh, we have mentioned it, but you haven't let us speak. You haven't let the fishermen speak, and you haven't involved them in any of the work that you're doing. So I think that's quite disingenuous. I did get an email to say that, or a tweet to say that they'd invited somebody who'd retired from our association 10 years ago. So I mean, that's not helpful for any of the fishermen who are involved in this area at the moment. I think it definitely has been hijacked, if I'm being honest, and I think that's a real shame, because I think partnership could have achieved something better. I think now there's a real lack of trust, and I think it doesn't just come from the no-take zone. We've also had a number of campaigns from those same groups which have influenced the outcome of the marine protected areas over and above science, which have influenced the herring tax, which have influenced the cod box closures. There's been a whole suite of campaigns that have resulted in very unfortunate, I think, policies for local fishermen. And I think it's just a shame that we're now in this position. But I do worry somewhat that the government have actually provided £154,000 towards Arran Coast for the survey vessel, to go and find science and develop science. And I worry that they wouldn't provide, they wouldn't work with the fishermen in the same way. And I think what we should be doing is working across all stakeholders. If we're talking about all stakeholders being involved, we should be working with our fishermen in a reference fleet style, the way they do in Norway, so that we can all have a say in what happens. I definitely think that this has been a model to roll out across Scotland. And if I can say one thing, I would say I wouldn't want this model for the polarisation which has ensued over since 2008 to be rolled out to any of the other communities in Scotland, because it regardless of the scientific data, which, to be honest with you, is very contested, and there hasn't been much done by the government. There's not much that we can see that's showing the scientific benefits of Lamlash no-take zone. It may be beneficial, but we haven't seen that neutral science that we need. But I think more important than that has been the exclusion of local fishing communities to the narrative, and we can't keep going along with this. It's not acceptable to say that we all think this is wonderful when it could have been so much different.
And Duncan, do you find that you're having, and Duncan, does your members find that they're having any confrontation with like the offshore wind developments or anything like that?
Well, looking at the Western Isles, we've been working very well with Marine Scotland on co-management through the Regional Inshore Fisheries Group, and there have been very, very good, worthwhile projects that have taken place over the years. We're already seeing the marine squeeze with the ScotWind development, and we're seeing the closest to shore in the whole of Scotland, about 2 to 5 miles just west of Lewis there. So we're seeing less and less ground being available to the fishing industry. We're seeing floating turbines being proposed off the Bud of Lewis, and we see that we can work with renewables. I think there will be opportunities where loss of access to grounds, we see that. We're in discussion with them on how we can move forward to have lobster stock enhancement projects done to improve lobster stocks, to balance out, the loss of access they will have to lobster stock on the inshore grounds, and similarly looking at probably reseeding of scallops in areas where I must stress there has been no scallop dredging in Lochaber ever, and whatever has having impact on scallops, the scallop stock's declining there. So we're looking and discussed with them just in fact last week on how something could be done to replenish an area that when I was a kid, the scallops were just teeming around there. It was all done, all the scallop removal there was done by scallop divers, or any negative impact that they may have had on fish farming development. Those were the two things that did happen in that area. And I think we can work with the renewables for community benefit in different areas. And with renewables, I think the fishing industry in different areas can work with them to ensure that if there is any negative impact on the industry, that at least there is some community benefit that can be gained. However, I see no community benefit whatsoever from closing areas in perpetuity, and the seasonal closure approach has worked very well for us, and that in both mobile and in static gear sectors has been a strength to the fishermen that are working there. They abide by it. They accept that it's something they're putting up themselves. And if you've got buy-in from the industry on things, I think it's got far more chance of success than someone from out with the area saying, this is what will impose on you. That will never work. And I hope it doesn't. And I hope that a pragmatic approach will be taken by the government, and just that HPMAs are dumped, and they understand that they were introduced in the first place for political reasons and will be the death knell of coastal and fragile fishing communities.
Have you got anything you want to add before we finish up?
I think just to say thank you so much for listening, and I think if I could just drive one point home, it's the one that Duncan made, that we do work through IFGs, that we are facing, we do have MPAs, we do have current closures, we do have seasonal closures, we do have a potential inshore cap coming, we do have priority marine features coming. The highly marine protected areas is maybe a show is probably the most visual show that we have done of objection. But please be aware that these debates have been going on for years, and the fishing industry has felt, I think, increasingly disenfranchised its voice is not coming across strongly. And I think I hope that this is a turning point where they realise that we've maybe just got to a point where we're at saturation point, and there needs to be a resetting of the relationship with government and fishing communities, which is more based on equality and a giving into toing of information. We need to get. I would love to get to the point where Norway are, where we have reference fleets going out and we're working with our government. But we need to be in an environment where there's an element of trust, and we need to get to there as quickly as possible, I think.
Yeah, the only thing I'd conclude with is looking back at MPAs and the way they were introduced, there were a range of options, that were being considered. The most draconian option that was there, despite having been in communities to discuss it over, I would say, a 3-year period. The Cabinet Secretary at the time, Richard Lochaber, introduced and supported the most draconian measures. There's been vast areas of sea that were closed for the first tranche of MPAs that had no features whatsoever, and there was no need to close them. I look at Mingley reefs, where vessels were fishing very, very selectively on mud for nephrobes. They were averaging then at that particular time £12 a kilo, and it was designated for coral. Now, coral is nowhere near mud, so they could have easily sown those muddy grounds and allowed those vessels to carry on. What it did do was displace those vessels onto areas that were already fully exploited and increased interaction between static gear and mobile gear, because those vessels weren't bothering anyone where they were. They shifted them to another area, so they caused untold problems already. West of Ross MPA, for example, was designated to protect merle. The government advisors themselves told them that merle is in depths shallower than 23 metres. One of the options we did consider, or was available and went out for public consultation at the time, was to have a depth zoning there of 30 metres. And the final option they went for was close the whole area and down to 100 metres. So there's huge amounts of ground. And at the same time, when the Cabinet Secretary said that it couldn't be zoned by depth because it couldn't be enforced, we arranged for 2 Marine Scotland enforcement officials to go to Denmark, have a look at a dredged fishery that was operated commercially there and zoned by depth. Before that was the anchor lap system went on to those vessels. In Denmark, they used to get 30 telephone calls a day of vessels fishing there illegally. Anchor lap was installed on those vessels. They didn't get one phone call a day after it was installed. We installed it on a scallop vessel in the Western Isles just to show that you could zone an area, and they knew exactly with sensors on winches where those vessels were actually fishing. And after 8 days, the same compliance officer said, we can zone any area now by depth, and we know where those vessels are fishing. What has happened? We were saying to the Cabinet Secretary that was then there at the time, Fergus Ewing, they've already invested 1.25 million in technology. Industry should see some reward to industry on the investment that's been done in technology, and some of those marine protected areas should be reduced because they were introduced needlessly. So there's a lot of things. They seem to be of the opinion that marine protected areas, when they were introduced, I said, when you go back to the drawing table and review things, accept that you got it wrong, because you're making the assumption that the baseline that you put across to everyone was right, but it really wasn't. So if you're reviewing your thing, accept that you got it wrong and reduce the areas. You've got the technology to move and move forward. And I think that's how any government should be. And the government should accept that the first tranche of MPAs, they did get it wrong, and go back to the drawing table on that and start afresh.
If I can just back onto what Duncan said there as well, he mentioned the previous Cabinet Secretary, Fergus Ewing. We did develop a future of fisheries management strategy for Scotland for its inshore fisheries as well, which was actually hugely optimistic. It talked about sustainability, it talked about new markets, talked about working together, all of those things. And I believe that actually the potential in our fishing industry, the sustainable potential, is amazing. And so we shouldn't always be talking in the negative. But Duncan's made a point that it does seem right now that it's only ever going to be a loss of grounds or a loss of potential. I think we have to reverse that thinking and start thinking about what we can do to actually make us flourish. Go back to the future fisheries management strategy and look at those objectives that we set out. And what I would say is that quite a few of the key objectives in the Bute House Agreement would actually almost make the future fisheries management strategy impossible to deliver. And if that's the case, then we need to start making sure that our policies are speaking to each other and not against each other. And we need to start giving our fishing communities a bit of respect, a little bit of optimism, and a bit more of involvement in their own lives.
Yeah, it does seem to be that the fishing communities are sacrificing a lot at the moment between marine protected areas, HPMAs, and offshore wind. And it's, I suppose, a topic for another day, how offshore wind's going to affect things. But I'm really happy to have both of you here today, and thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. And hopefully we'll have you back on sometime soon again, and we might have more positive news in regards to the HPMAs.
Thank you very much.
That's fine. Thanks very much.
Thank you.